Okay, welcome to Chapter 1 of our course here at Wake Tech. These lectures are going to be recorded. We're going to have 15 different chapters. We're going to be using the textbook Criminal Justice in Action, and this is the 11th edition, if you're following along, and that's by Gaines and Miller. The publishers there are Cengage Publishers. So if you have an earlier edition, it might be a little confusing, but we're going to be using the 11th edition, which is just coming out new for 2022 in the fall. So I did record these earlier as the 10th edition, and there's not a lot of changes, but I did try to do a few updates, and I made the slides a little bit jazzier, so have at it. Let's go through the okay, 1 second. Okay, so a couple quick notes to our Wake Tech students here. This again is for CJC 111. That's our Introduction to Criminal Justice. This is our foundational course for the other 64 or 60 hours you're going to be taking here at Wake Tech. This first chapter just gives you a broad overview of what we're going to talk about, a few important concepts. Each of the later chapters are very general. In fact, each of the later chapters really stands for separate courses that we have. So criminology, police operations, to some extent victimology, which we're going to talk about a little bit in the coming days, constitutional law, criminal law. All of these are separate classes that you might take, but also you're going to get a quick exposure to them here. This also is a college transfer course for Wake Tech, so I know some of you are not criminal justice majors, so I'm not going to make a lot of assumptions about that. The other thing that Wake Tech students should be aware of is that I've supplemented the text with a good deal of information about North Carolina and some recent events as well. This is not to say that that's going to be the focus of the class. It's really just something to, I think, add immediacy and to help you understand what's going on. Okay, so the first question to ask before we begin is and I think these are important. I'm going to ask several of these. Is at the beginning of each chapter. This first one is very pedagogical, which is really just means fancy word for teaching. What do we know? How can we know it? What do we think is true but isn't? These are just three simple questions, but like most simple questions, they really hide very deep and complex ideas. One of the things, and this relates to the first to the third, is we know certain things. We know the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Well, that's true. Conversely, we know things that are not correct, that we think are true. We might think, oh, well, the second president of the United States was Thomas Jefferson. Well, it wasn't Thomas Jefferson, it was John Adams. But a lot of people may not know that. Now, some things we know we don't know. If I said who was the 7th Secretary of State in the United States, people would go, well, I got no idea, I don't know that. And you might have an ability to look it up. Which kind of leads us to our second question. What can we know? There are some things that we can know objectively. Now, this is not a philosophy course, but I think it's important to delve into some philosophical ideas as we start our study, so I'll try to keep them as light as possible. There are two broad perspectives that one can analyze reality with. You can analyze it as an objective reality. That is, that we all share this world, that there are truths in this world, and that we can determine these truths by our shared observations. This is objective reality. So, for example, in objective reality, we can determine the speed of light, or how much a quart of milk weighs, or how tall the Empire State Building is, because we can measure this, and those measures can be shared between us, and we can agree upon them. But there's also another reality, the subjective reality. And this is more subtle and a little bit more difficult. So it often calls for us to make a judgment about why as opposed to how big or how long or how tall or how fast. We're asking a question like why. So in criminal justice in particular, we might ask the question, why did someone do something? Were they acting in reasonable self-defense? Were they acting in anger? How do you know if someone is angry? Well, there might be external objective signs. They might get red in the face. They might get irate. But that doesn't mean that that's why they acted that way. It's very subjective. And subjectivity is important. It's not something we can dismiss, particularly in the criminal law. The final point there is I want you always to remember that sometimes we think things are true, but they're not. Sometimes we think, well, this is what I know about the criminal justice system. This is what I know about criminals. This is what I know about police officers. And some of that might come from objective reality, and some of it might come from our subjective experiences, which is not to invalidate either one of those, but sometimes we think that objective experience is true or that subjective experience is true, and it isn't. So just bear in mind, and we'll see some examples pretty quick. Okay, so these learning objectives you're going to see, you're going to see them in the beginning of each one of the chapters we're going to cover here at Wake Tech. These learning objectives really are for the Wake Tech students. They kind of give you a roadmap to what we hope to teach you in the class. And you don't have to worry too much about them. They aren't going to appear in a quiz or a test, but you can go back and you can look at them and they give you a quick overview of the chapter. Enough said about that. Alright, so at the beginning of this chapter 1, it talks about George Floyd. And that's fairly recent in history, obviously. Although depending when you watch this video, it might be a ways in the past. George Floyd was a black man in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he was making a purchase in a grocery store, and at the grocery store he used a counterfeit bill. Now, it's not terribly important for us to know, did he know it was a counterfeit bill or did he not know? But when the police were called because there was a counterfeit bill, he was confronted by the police, and several people around him, including a woman named Darnell Frazier, took out their cell phone and began to record this confrontation. Now the police claimed that Floyd was acting erratically and refused them to show his hands. Eventually, Officer Derek Chauvin used force to subdue Mr. Floyd, pinning him to the ground, the asphalt, and kneeling on his neck. While he was being restrained, Mr. Floyd said, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." He repeated it. Of course, the police officers doing this were white and Asian. Police officer Chauvin was on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes, and he was unresponsive for the last 3 of which he essentially had the life pressed out of him. Now, the result of this, because it became a major incident in American policing, was that this video taken by Miss Frazier and a few others was released on the internet, and it caused riots. There were demonstrations across the United States, there were riots, there was violence and property damage, and of course eventually there was a trial for the police officers which were found guilty. Now, the question here we can look at is, should the police be allowed to use force against a non-violent offender? Because what happened here is you had a non-violent crime, the passing of a counterfeit bill, and the police, in order to bring him into custody, had to use force or violence. And you might say, well, they used force. How did that work out? Well, they said, we used force so that we didn't have to use deadly force, but it spread and of course caused greater violence to the larger communities. So what do we do when someone refuses to cooperate? How much force should we use? And these are all legitimate questions, and they go to all sorts of things we're going to look at in this chapter, like what a crime is, what's proper behavior, what rights people have. Okay, one of the things, if we look at this this slide here, is this is trends in U.S. violent crime and property crime for the last, oh gosh, almost 30 years, from 1993 to 2018. So, of course, we're in 2022, and we've been essentially in a sort of lockdown or recovery from lockdown for the last 2 years. So we don't have a lot of great data, and it would be data that I wouldn't necessarily trust immediately because of it, because if you have this overwhelming event, it can really skew how things are going. So let's look at the last almost 30 years, and you'll notice that in 1993, if we look at violent crime, and the number here is being generated as per 100, there were 747.1 violent crimes for every 100,000 people in the United States. So if you had a state like Wyoming, which I think has about 500,000 people in it, or if you have a state that had 10 million people in it, so suppose you had a state that had 10 million, that would mean that there were 74,710 violent crimes. Now, we can also break it down by the BUS rates, and that's the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and the other one is an FBI statistic. So none of these are what you could call, I hate to use the term, academic or liberal. These are generated from the police, the FBI. So you'll notice that violent crimes there fell from 79 to 23, or property crimes, again this is an FBI number, falls from 4,700, obviously there's more property crimes than there are crimes of violence, to 2,100. And property crimes for 100 in a household, this is the Bureau of Justice again, fell from 351 to 106, so that's a fall of almost 2/3. Long story short here, using this chart, we can see, and this is an objective truth that we all should be able to agree on, is that crime has fallen dramatically since 1993, just has fallen off a cliff. You are living in one of the historically the lowest rates of crime in the United States. And we're going to look at where we generate those numbers in a minute. But this is important because this is the first context, this is the first bit of information. And this might fall into that first analysis where I said, what do we know? What do we know that's true? What do we know that's false? Well, we might have thought we knew the crime rate, and if you thought the crime rate's down dramatically, good for you. You knew something was true. If you didn't know the crime rate had fallen so much, well, here is where we can start to correct that opinion. Here is where we can start to take an opinion based on a falsehood and generate one that is now based on a truth. Okay, the next thing, and this is where your book really starts, it says, what is crime? Okay, well, at a very, again, simple questions often call or hide very complex answers. So at a very basic level, sure, crime is just you broke the law or you violated the law being something punished by a fine or incarceration or capital punishment or death. But in fact, it's a more complex thing, and there is what I would call a missing step. Now, your book talks about determining criminal behavior. This is really what I'm getting at. There is a question we have to ask: why are some things defined as a crime and other things not defined as a crime? And who gets to decide what is and isn't a crime, which your book tends to focus on? I put this first kind of cartoon in here, and I like cartoons. And you'll notice there's two figures. There's a woman on each side of these panels. On the first side where it says crime, if you're poor and get caught with drugs, it's a crime. And you'll notice she's saying, I'm doing 8 months for possession. If you're rich and get caught with drugs, it's a scandal. And you'll notice it says, I'm going to rehab. And you know, she's dressed better. She's got pearls and a kind of bizarre glasses. And the other one is behind bars. And the quote I include is not a particularly important book for you to know, but I think it's nicely sums up this. In its majestic equality, the law forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, beg in the streets, and steal loaves of bread. All those you would recognize as crimes. And obviously someone made them crimes to beg in the street or steal loaves of bread. Well, rich people, people with property, people who have food to eat, don't have to worry about this. Or sleeping under bridges. Rich people don't sleep under bridges. People that have houses don't sleep under bridges. So some things are criminalized, some things aren't. So let's ask ourselves why and what. Okay, so people operate on the perception. They create one perception of what they think is crime. They believe that violent crime is that should be bigger threat, and they believe that most criminals are street criminals. But the reality is quite different. I'm going to show you a chart in a minute called from On Broken Laws and Unprotected Workers. This is not to focus on this, but this is to show that, in fact, even if we know what crime is, even if we know, oh, crime is down, there's many things that are being hidden behind it. So on the right side of your screen here, you'll see what I would call the common perception of crime. Probably if I ask you what's a serious crime when people steal something, the term you're going to use is robbery. And robbery has a specific legal definition here. Robbery is when someone through force, usually, or threat of force, takes something from someone else. So classic example, I take a gun, I put it in your face, and I say, give me your wallet. That's a robbery. And you'll notice that the total value, don't worry about the total number, but the total value of goods stolen this way is 0.34 billion, or 340 million if you prefer. And then we can look at something like auto theft, which is 3.8 billion, or burglary, breaking into someone's house and stealing something, 4.3, or other larcenies. Again, these would be other types of theft. It's about 5.3. So you'll notice for each one of those four categories there probably would be, if we focus on Raleigh here, Raleigh, North Carolina, a separate division or department or investigative unit that would handle burglaries or auto theft or larcenies or robberies. And the police would have people dedicated, and the courts would have a structure, and there would be laws against them. But let's just focus on robbery for a second, because, as I said, that's one that most people associate with serious crime. 0.34 billion, or 340 million. Now let's compare that to the other side of this chart, the blue side. These are when an employer steals from his employees. He can do that by, he might be required to pay minimum wage and he doesn't. He might be required to pay overtime and he doesn't. He might be required to give you break room rests, or he might be required to give you a lunch break and he doesn't. Or he might require you to work off the clock. So if we just took the off the clock violation, or if we took the minimum wage violations where you should have gotten minimum wage and you didn't, and you compare that biggest blue block to the smallest block over there of robbery, that's 340 billion versus 0.34 billion versus $23 billion. So it's not 10 times bigger, it's 70 times bigger. There's 70 times more minimum wage theft than there is robbery. Yet if you picked up the phone and said, hey, my boss didn't pay me the overtime he owed me, the police would say, well, sue him. It's not a criminal matter. We're not going to handle it like if you stole $20 out of the cash register you're working for your boss, he's going to call the cops and you're going to go to jail. If he doesn't pay you proper wages, you're going to have to sue him, or contact the EEOC or someone to get him to pay you. All right. So another concept I want to introduce here, and this is some information that's not in your text, and then we'll focus back on the purpose of the criminal justice system, is you should be aware of the ideas of ethnocentrism and chronocentrism. Now, ethno comes from ethnic, which you're all familiar with. Chrono is terminology meaning time. So ethnocentrism is the idea that your society, which you grew up with, is what is normal. That's what you expect. Chronocentrism is not just your society and your experience is normal, but the time you're living. So the cartoon over there, you've got two chickens, and this goes back to the old joke, why did the chicken cross the road? And the answer is to get the other side. But the one chicken is yelling out, how do I get to the other side? The chicken on the other side says, you are on the other side. From your point of view, you can ask a question of somebody else, and they might have a different perspective. That's ethnos. You might think, well, it's perfectly normal to smoke a cigarette. But you could go to another country where tobacco is unknown or forbidden. This is particularly true, I think, if we take an innocent example, food. You can go some places where they put ketchup on their French fries, and other places where they put vinegar on them. You can go some places where honey is a delicacy that people like, and other places where honey is seen as kind of a disgusting food. So it's just, what did you grow up? What did you experience in your society? Now, chronocentrism's a little bit more different. You'll often hear people say, "What about this guy in the past? He did this. He owned slaves, or he treated his wife poorly." And one of the defenses, I guess you'll hear of that is, well, that's what that time was like. That was what was normal in the past. And then you'll hear people say, well, we need to change things so things are better in the future. And people will say, well, whatever happens in the future, this is what's going on now. We believe that the past and the future aren't relevant, that what's going on now defines for us right and wrong, that we can't take our values now and project them into the past or project them into the future. And trust me, as we go on, that'll be an important point. Okay, now your book turns to determining criminal behavior, and again, not an easy task. It clearly is related to some idea of what is wrong. And what is wrong relates to further terms like morality and ethics. It's also clear, and this goes to our ethnocentrism, that different countries have different ideas of what is and isn't a crime. Even different states in the United States have different crimes. In some states, it's legal to get recreational marijuana. In other states, it's not. In some states, it's legal to have prostitution. In most states, it's not. In some states, the age to buy tobacco was or is 16. In other states, it's 21. So certainly, different states define it differently, different countries, even individuals define crime differently. Some people will say, well, what he did, I don't consider it a crime. And other people will say, no, it's absolutely a crime. There can be the definition society gives us, and then there's our own definition. Okay, your book talks about two broad models about what is and how this is set up. It talks about what it calls the consensus model, and then it talks about the conflict model. And it says, if you want to know how a law is made, how a thing becomes a crime, the consensus model perspective says society, though it's very diverse, shares a set of similar moral values. And we understand what is right and wrong. And criminal acts violate those beliefs. And those acts are deemed harmful to society. And by almost a democratic consensus, we make something illegal. Most people think that child pornography is immoral. Most people think it is wrong. Therefore, it is criminalized. Now, the conflict model, while not rejecting the consensus model, says, well, this exists because really moral attitudes are not constant. They're not constant among people. So the content of the criminal law is determined not by this consensus of the whole society, but those that actually hold political power. Those groups then impose the values on the rest of the community. The group might think, well, this isn't a terribly bad thing, but the smaller group that's running things says, yes, it is, and we're going to make it a crime. So I do want to state that this is what's often called a false dichotomy. Don't think that there's only ever two perspectives to something when someone says, well, there's got to be A or B. Saying behavior is determined by either a consensus conflict or the consensus or a conflict model. That's a false dichotomy. There might be other alternatives we could explore. Even saying, well, this truth is somewhere between these two is not a great thing, because not every truth is a compromise or a blend of what are two things. And the example I use here is, some people will tell you the earth is round. Objectively, that is a true statement. Some people, and there are these flat earth society types, will say, nope, the world is flat. Well, guess what? In objective reality, as we measure it, the earth is round. It's not a blend of the two. One is absolutely right, one is absolutely wrong. All right, there's another concept that relates to this that we should introduce here, and that's deviance. Because sometimes people will say, well, a crime is deviant behavior. And sometimes that's even a pejorative or a negative term people use. They'll say, well, you're a deviant. Deviance is considered behavior or activity that goes against what's normal in society. It often is criminal, but not necessarily, because there can be a difference between deviance and crime. Sometimes something that's a crime is not an act of deviance. Almost everybody I know drives over the speed limit. So that's not deviance. In fact, people that absolutely obey the speed limit, that's deviant behavior. People that never exceed 35 in a 35. So sometimes things we all do, all right, are still crimes, not deviance. And sometimes a deviant behavior, even though a very small number of people do it. Suppose you listen to Italian opera. It's not a lot of people that do that. It's a percentage of the population, but it's not a crime. So deviance can get you part of the way, but it can't get you all the way there. Okay, let's try to develop then an integrated definition of what crime is. Crime is, using consensus and conflict models, crime is something punishable under the criminal laws defined by either the powerful minority or the majority of the population. It's considered an offense against society as a whole, and it's prosecuted by public officials. And the punishment is determined by statute, and it can include fines, loss of life, or liberty. All right, so now let's turn to the formal criminal justice system, the structure of it essentially. We have an interlocking series, three major parts. We've got law enforcement agencies, shorthand is the police. We've got the courts that determine guilt or innocence. And then we've got prison or jail. So police, courts, jail. Now, they exist to perform, they maintain justice, but they exist to perform other functions as well. Like maybe they enforce public morality, maybe they enforce public order, maybe they establish political power. They certainly protect society from criminal behavior, but they do other things as well. So with these other things are called the informal system of criminal justice. Often there are stated and unstated goals of a system. The rationale for the formal system is what they say it is. So if I say, well, what's the purpose of the police? They might say, well, we're to protect and serve. That's true. That is one of their purposes. But there might be other purposes of the police. You might ask, what's the purposes of an instructor at Wake Technical Community College? Well, his purpose is to teach students the criminal justice. But there are other purposes. One of the purposes is I make a living doing this. Most systems are based upon stakeholders, people who interact with that system. People will act to benefit their own group or themselves, and different groups will have different goals. All right, let's talk a little bit about the types of crimes that exist. The violent crimes, the ones everybody pays attention to, are murder, sexual assault, assault and battery, robbery. Then you got your important property crimes, larceny, burglary, motor vehicle. We also can talk a little bit about public order crimes. These would be very often called victimless crimes. Your book talks a little bit about marijuana here and uses it as a segue to federalism. White collar crimes, these are crimes committed usually in a business context, and cyber crimes, because every text nowadays has to talk about cyber crimes. So let's get back to the purposes of the criminal justice system. What is the purpose? Well, the purpose of the criminal justice system has stated purposes, like I said, and has other ones. And some of those other ones can be positive, some of them can be negative, can relate to things. And these are just some concepts: racism, sexism, economic systems, all of those play a part in criminal justice. The stated purpose is to protect society from potential future crimes of the most dangerous offenders, to determine when an offense has been committed, this is the kind of court role, and to rehabilitate those that are being punished so that you can return them. And finally, there's one that doesn't get a lot, but really relates to something called victimology, to support crime victims and return them to their pre-crime status. Those are stated purposes. Does it protect society? Let's look at that first one and some of the others. All right, so as I said, it protects society from future harms, but that presupposes that we are really in the business of predicting the future. How do we know the guy that we're arresting now, by removing him or prosecuting him, is going to prevent a future crime? Now, it may. I'm not saying it isn't. But do we really want to structure a system to predict the future? To determine an offense has been committed. This is the court's role. Well, how do we do that? How do we reach that objective truth that we all can agree upon to determine what's a true? And then how do we decide what the appropriate punishment is? Which raises our third one. To rehabilitate the offenders. Well, all right, so you want to fix people. How good are we at fixing people? Does prison accomplish that? To support the crime victim. Does the system really support the crime victim? Is that what it's there for? Okay, so we have the unstated purposes as well. One of the unstated purposes, and these are just a couple, there are more, is the preservation of property and power by those who possess both. It can be used to suppress internal oppositions. Now, some of these internal oppositions are pretty dangerous. It might be used to suppress white supremacy or radical terrorists. It also maintains what is normal in society. That's part of the criminal justice system. You know, you don't play your music at 2 o'clock in the morning because that's not normal. Now, this is a cynical one, but I think it's an important one because it really comes out and says something. I think it's useful. Now, this is a quote from John Ehrlichman, who was the counsel and assistant president of the United States, and this talks about the war on drugs. I thought this meshed well with that discussion of marijuana in your text early on. And they were interviewing him long after he'd left office, and they were talking about the war on drugs. And he said, "You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war, that would be the Vietnam War, or to be black. But by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana," and shorthand there was hippies opposed the war supposedly, "and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both, we could disrupt those communities." So a law was made, according to him, not for all these other purposes, but for a political purpose. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night in the evening news. Did we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we did. Now this goes at least some way to explain why in the federal schedule, marijuana, which is not a narcotic and is not a particularly dangerous drug, it is a drug, the THC in it at least, is a Schedule I narcotic, which is up there with heroin. Okay, maintaining justice. Let's talk a little bit about justice before we get to discretion and ethics and a few things like that. Justice is the quality of fairness in determining guilt or innocence. Both justice and fairness, though, are subjective, not objective terms. People are going to have different ideas of what is just and what is fair, and that's going to be informed by their own ideals and their own experiences. So our structure now is a federalist system. And to understand these concepts of justice, and you have to understand the system itself. You have to understand that there is a federal component, a state component, and a local component. And then further, there are federal police, federal courts, state courts, federal prisons, state prisons. For the state, if we look at the police, most states will adopt, well, it's about half and half, it's about split. North Carolina will have a splitting of its police. We have a SBI, the State Bureau of Investigation, and we have a highway patrol. Lots of states don't do that. If you took Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania doesn't have a highway patrol and an SBI. They have what they call the state police. It performs both functions. We broke it up. And about half the states have a split, and about half the states have a unified one. Locally, how do the police operate? Well, if you live here in Wake County and Raleigh. The two major local police agencies are the county, which is the Sheriff's Department, Wake County Sheriff's Department, and the largest city in Wake County is Raleigh, although there are those cities. So you have the Raleigh Police and the Wake County Sheriff. Of course, they do most of the policing. Yes, the Highway Patrol does give people tickets. Yes, the SBI does arrest people. But if you compare it to how many arrests Raleigh makes or how many tickets Raleigh make, it's going to dwarf them. The federal system operates across both the U.S. and even outside our nation's boundaries, and it's got lots of different agencies with multiple different functions. It cooperates with, but does not directly control, the local and state police forces, police, courts, corrections. Here's a breakdown to give you an idea of the numbers here so that we can know what we're talking about. You'll notice that there is, if you look at law enforcement, this would be the police, the shortening. You'll notice the vast majority of police, about 900,000, 882, 965, about 900,000 are local cops. Only about 100,000 are state cops, and about 200,000 are federal cops. So by far, 75% or so are your locals. When we go to justice and legal, and these would be your court systems, again, the vast bulk are locals. These are your magistrates, your small claims courts, your local municipal courts. They're going to handle, there's about 300,000 of those, 250, excuse me. There's about 175 states, so they're close. Okay, they're certainly going to handle the important ones. And again, though, the feds there, it's only about 60,000. Only when we get to prisons, corrections, when we look at prisons and jails, do we see that the states now are the largest component. There's about 450,000 people that work for the state. Those are usually in prisons. It's about 259,000 that work locally. Those are usually jails. That's the difference. Jails are run by the county and the prisons are run by the state typically. And then again, a small sliver is federal. So our final numbers there, you'll see that it's a local game. Criminal justice is a local phenomenon that we need to study. All right, now the court system, like the police, there's both federal and state courts. Federal courts try only federal crimes, just as state courts try only state crimes. Who are the participants in this? Who's the players in this game? Well, you've got the judge, who is supposedly a neutral referee that supports and guarantees due process. You got the prosecutor, who represents the state with a duty not only to convict, but also broadly to seek justice. And you got the defense attorney, who represents his client, whose primary purpose is to maintain his client's innocence. Now, obviously, there are informal duties. The judge, we're in 2022, it is election year. So in North Carolina, our judges are going to be elected. So they've got to go out and win the public support. And they may want to advance. They might want to go from a district court judge to a superior court judge, from a superior to a court of appeals judge, to a North Carolina Supreme Court judge. Also, typically, they're going to have different experiences. They're going to be in a different social and economic class than the defendants. Prosecutors can be motivated to win, to advance again, much like the judge. The defense attorney, why do most defense attorneys represent people charged with crimes? Because they're paid. They also have to consider, well, what's my future relationships going to be with the DA or the judge? What's my public expectations of me? If we look at our third part of the system here, corrections, the most common result of corrections, the three options, is probation. Most people don't go to jail or prison for what they do. If you think about your interaction, most of you, if you've interacted with the police and you've been punished, you got a fine. Maybe you got a probation. Incarceration can be in prison if it's very serious. It's usually our felonies. Or it can be in jail. Then we've got community-based correction. This is alternatives, halfway houses, work release, probation. This is parole primarily. All right, so here is, and this kind of goes to your chart on 13, but I changed a little bit. Your chart is sometimes called a funnel, but you'll notice what happens here. And I kind of put in the chapters as I thought they really went. So we've got the first stage, which a hidden step really. What's a crime? Then we go to stage 1. You enter into the system. There's got to be a criminal act. That's going to be chapter 3. There's going to be an investigation. And there's going to be an arrest. Then we go to our stage 2. You're going to be prosecuted, preliminary hearing, grand jury, possible charges dismissed. Now we go to adjudication, your actual trial. That's going to be chapter 10. Now we go to stage 4, sentencing, and then we'll talk about, obviously this is most common in probations. And then we go to 5, if you're sentenced and you go to prison or jail, what's it going to be like serving it, and what's going to happen when you're released. Here's a practical example, though, if we look at kind of the numbers of this, of how it goes. Stage 1, most violent deaths that occur in the United States are not treated as homicide. So the most common intentional death is, in fact, suicide, but we could also look at things, there's 48,000 of those in 2019. And the second thing, of course, we talk about homicides is, okay, if someone dies, we have to decide it's a homicide. And we can guess that about half of all homicides are not detected. And that could be something as undetectable as, someone was suffering a debilitating disease, and in order to ease their pain, they were given a overdose of morphine or something like that. That would be technically a homicide, but it wouldn't go reported. Or it could be simply someone got away with murder. So let's look at the total reported homicides. In 2019, and if we compare there were about 16,000 homicides versus almost 25,000 homicides in 1991. So again, a significant drop. Then we have to look at arrests or clearances. About 60% are arrested, right? And this can vary with crime. Then we look at convictions. About 70% of those arrested, get convicted. So if we started with 16,000, now we're down to about 3,000 arrested or cleared. And there can be wide variations in our last step about how people are punished. All right, so we have an abstract system. What's a crime? Commission of crime, detection, apprehension, determination, punishment. Then we got the practical example of how it works. One of the things, and now your book starts to talk about discretion, and I kind of changed the order. If you're following along in the text, you'll notice that I put a lot of the crime in focus, the violent crime, at the front, and then I put the discretion or ethics here at the back a little bit. Resources are finite, so the amount of attention and effort you can allocate to any problem has to be weighed against what you're going to do for the rest. If you want to focus on, I want to stop murders, you might not have as much resources to investigate burglaries. If you say, I'm going to focus on traffic stops, you may not have as much energy to focus on things like drug sales. The police, the courts, the corrections, all have to decide what or who to focus on and what methods to employ. And this motivation of discretion is often less clear because it's much more subjective. It begins to move out of the objective and into the subjective, leading to informal decisions of great consequences. So discretion exists in making the law, that hidden step, enforcing the law, and the punishment. Interpretation law is a good example of this. Very often we have to interpret, is this act serious enough to warrant an arrest? Let's go back to that blue and blue-colored graph I showed you. Should we interpret the failure to pay overtime when the overtime was worked as a theft? Well, we don't, right? So there can be a pitfall here. Formal systems may be in place to prevent a substitution of an individual's judgment for a general rule. But any system has to allow for some discretion. You can push discretion out of one area, it's going to go someplace else because we're not robots. All right, a little bit about this discretion and ethics and justice. And your book has some discussion about things like there's a discretion in action called the sexting scandal. But ethics is the practical application of what is right and wrong. And not everything in the law is just, because sometimes laws can be unjust or unfair. We particularly recognize this if we go into the past. We'll say, well, that law was not right. There was a law in the United States for years and years and years that slavery was okay. There was a law in the United States that women couldn't vote. There was a law in the United States that you could have separate but equal facilities. Well, we recognize that that's not just, but those laws existed. And it makes us say, well, there's the law. Is it just? Ethics requires an appreciation of what is justice. And one of the questions, and this is one you're going to struggle with, I think, your whole life, is can you substitute individual ethical decision making when there are general rules that say no? What do we do here? Okay, so ethics is from the Greek ethos, meaning character. And it's the rational way of deciding what's good for an individual or society. Morality is your individual code. So morality is what's right and wrong. Ethics is its application. All right, so criminal justice today is in many ways a struggle between two broad ideas. One is due process. I want to live in a free society. The other one is safety. I want to live where there's less crime. So we say there's a struggle between the crime control model and the due process model. We also today are seeking better policing, and we're going to talk about evidence-based practices. But we should be wary that these can result in an attack on due process, a surrendering of our basic freedoms. Gun control is an interesting issue here. Now, tragically, as I record this, there has been a shooting in Texas where 19 elementary school children and 2 of their teachers were killed. Those are the numbers so far. So this is a mass shooting. So now the question becomes, okay, do you want to stop those, or do you want to be free to own guns? All right, so how many guns? What guns? I mean, should there be background checks? Should there be a mental health issue here? Gun control is a good example of this. How much due process are you willing to give up to control guns? Now, this is an interesting one, and I don't need to use these labels, but I think it makes it easier for us. Is you might say, in this case, a conservative will say, well, my freedom is more important to own the gun. The Second Amendment rights are more important than the damage that is potentially being done. And a liberal might say, well, no, the damage is more important. Now, if you flip that around, if you took something like pornography, traditionally conservatives would say, well, it's more important to stop pornography or drugs than it is that you should have the freedom to do what you want. And I think that shows a degree of inconsistency. If you say, well, due process is most important, you could be consistent. But people aren't consistent because, again, they are stakeholders. They have different things at stake and different perspectives. All right. One of the things you should also be aware of is we live in a changing time. I can't keep this course stable and unchanging because America's changing. One of the things that happened the last long term is the advent of camera phones. In the past, when I was growing up, back in the 1960s, the general public perspective was, yes, there were a few misconducts of the police, but most of these complaints are really just tall tales. They weren't true. And all of a sudden we began, and this really started back in the early part of this with camcorders, believe it or not, with a man named Rodney King in Los Angeles who was beaten by the police, and then the police lied on their reports about it. And that was kind of, I think, the start of the public appreciation, because the public became more of an eyewitness, and there was more objective reality to show people. People had their own subjective opinions. Police don't beat suspects. Police do beat suspects. Those were 2 different ones. All of a sudden, fast forward to today, and if we started these lectures talking about George Floyd, all of a sudden we have those videos. Yeah, here the cop is on his neck. Here the cop is going too far. So one of the results of this is the police have lost a lot of public support and are under pressure for reform. This is where we get movements like defund the police. This shows, again, and I talked about this before, this conflict between what we want. there can be elements in society that are focused on crime control. Let's stop crime. More arrests rather than the right arrest. Almost a presumption of guilt. Less adversarial, less trials, more plea bargaining. More content focus. What happened? And you give more power in the crime control model to the police and to the prosecutors. Now, the due process is different. It's more concerned with individual rights. Getting the right arrest rather than any arrest. Preserving that, okay, we're going to presume you're innocent. Preserving the idea of trials. Focusing on the process and giving more power in some ways to defense attorneys. Okay. Now, your book didn't talk a lot about this, but I want to mention it again to make it a little bit more relevant, than some of the other things your text was talking about. Traditional law enforcement was focused on foreign terrorists, particularly after 9/11. But what the Capitol Hill insurrection, I'm going to call it an insurrection, you can call it a riot, you can call it a coup, you can call it whatever you want, really refocuses on the idea that most terrorism in the United States, and has been true over our history, is domestic, whether it comes from the left or it comes from the right. Most terrorism is a U.S.-born phenomenon. Now, currently, I think it's fair to say that most acts of violence, terrorist acts of violence, I won't necessarily say that's true for domestic disturbances like all riots, tend to come from the right. Now, this is a long pattern. The Ku Klux Klan formed after the American Civil War. American Civil War ends 1865. The Klan still exists today. For more than 100 years, it operated openly. It lynched people. It burned crosses. It beat people. It raped people. It stole. But we could go back to the early part of the 1900s, and we could talk about the wave of leftist anarchist bombings, including the Wall Street bombing and others, that killed dozens and hundreds of people before it ended. So today, yes, we do have terrorism from the right primarily, I would say is a fair argument, white supremacists. So you have things like the Capitol Hill insurrection and the Charlottesville riots. But you do have some left. You do have movements like Occupy Wall Street, which people have seen as illegal, and indeed they did violate some crimes, and some of the riots stemming from defunding the police, which is seen by and large as a leftist political movement, the due process movement. Prison population trends, things to look at. Now, these are just things that are keep in your back of mind as we look at some other stuff. Starting in the 1980s, prison populations rose in the United States, prisons, jails, about 500%. And you might say, well, that's why crime went down. No, it started well before crime went down. And they peaked about 2008 and have been declining a little bit. And crime's still been falling even though prison populations fall. So there's not a strong relationship there. But it's something to think about. We have a lot of people in prison. Another interesting thing, the death penalty. Throughout the 20th century, if we start from 1900 and we go to the year 2000, we start at relatively high rates of capital punishment execution, and it falls steadily. And as we go into the 21st century, from 2001 to today, it's fallen even faster. The other things to examine are things like race and incarceration, because this is related to prison, is what percentage of people in prison are ethnic minorities, Hispanic, Asian, Indian, Native American, black. What about the de-incarceration movement, where we're looking at or questioning the whole idea of mass incarceration as effective? All right, the last thing I'm going to look at here, and I try to keep these lectures to right around an hour, is some micro lectures. Now, I haven't recorded these yet, so they may or may not be immediately available to you, but I'm going to talk a little bit about a few things like statistics and ethnocentrism, a little bit of chronocentrism there, a little bit of due process, a little bit of interpretation of what due process is, and a little bit more about domestic terrorism. And these lectures will be about 5 minutes, and they're really to expand and help you just on these concepts. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and whenever you're ready, move on to 2.